I want to tell you my story slowly, not because it is difficult to tell, but because it took me a lifetime to understand it. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I was born in 1947 in a small, quiet town just outside Cleveland, Ohio. Back then, towns were quieter, people spoke less, and emotions were something you carried inside, not something you shared. My parents worked at a factory. They didn't talk much about feelings. They believed food on the table and a roof over your head were love enough. From them, I learned how to stay quiet and how to endure. As a young woman, I didn't dream big. I didn't imagine grand adventures or faraway places. All I wanted was a simple life, a home, a family, and peace. At 21, I married Tom Hayes. He had kind eyes and tired hands from long shifts at the auto plant. We bought a small two-story house on Maple Street in Columbus, painted it pale yellow ourselves, planted rose bushes along the walkway. That house became my whole world. I still remember the sound of Thomas' boots at the door every evening. I would set dinner early so it stayed warm for him. Those were good years, not perfect, but honest then. In 1969, my son Daniel was born. The moment they placed him in my arms, something inside me changed forever. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment my life stopped being about me. 3 years later, everything ended. Tom died in a head on collision during a snowstorm. One moment I was a wife, the next a widow with a 3-year-old child clinging to my leg. People expected me to fall apart, but I didn't have that luxury. I sold the car, moved into a smaller house, took a job at the library during the day, and waitress at night. I learned how to survive on very little sleep. I learned how to smile even when my chest felt heavy. Most importantly, I learned how to be strong quietly. Daniel never knew hunger, never knew fear, and I made sure he never knew how close I came to giving up. At night, I read him stories even when my eyes burned from exhaustion. On weekends, I washed his clothes by hand and hung them out back. Every small sacrifice felt natural. That's what mothers do. As Daniel grew older, I saw promise in him. He was smart, curious, ambitious in ways I had never allowed myself to be. I pushed him forward, always forward. When he became valedictorian, I sat in the front row and cried quietly. When he got accepted to Stanford, my hands shook so badly I almost dropped the letter. The day I drove him to the airport, I hugged him too tightly. He laughed and said, "Mom, you're going to crush me." I watched the plane disappear into the sky and drove home in silence. That silence followed me for years. When Daniel left for college, the house changed in ways I did not expect. Not suddenly, not loudly, but slowly, like dust settling in corners you stop looking at. At first, I kept his room exactly the same, his bed neatly made, his old posters still on the wall. I told myself he would come back during holidays and everything should feel familiar. Every Sunday evening, I cooked more than I needed. Old habits are hard to break. I would set 2 plates on the table without thinking, then quietly put one back in the cupboard. Those were the moments that hurt the most, not the big things, but the small, ordinary ones. Daniel called often in the beginning. He told me about his classes, his professors, the cold mornings, and how different everything felt. I listened more than I spoke. I always had. I never told him how quiet the house was, how I sometimes turned the television on just to hear another voice. I didn't want to be a burden. That word, burden, I didn't know then how important it would become later. Years passed quickly. Daniel graduated with honors. He stayed in California, found a job at a technology company, and started building a life far away from Maple Street. I was proud of him, deeply proud. Every achievement of his felt like a victory I had quietly paid for. But pride does not protect you from loneliness. Holidays became shorter. Visits became rare. Phone calls slowly changed from long conversations into quick check ins. How are you, Mom? I'm fine. Good. I'll call you later. Later sometimes meant weeks. I kept myself busy, worked extra shifts, volunteered at the church, helped neighbors when I could. I told myself this was how life worked. Children grow up, parents step aside. Then Daniel met Sophia. He told me about her over the phone. She was confident, ambitious, and driven. Everything the world admired. When I finally met her, she was polite but distant. She spoke quickly, efficiently, like time was always chasing her. At their wedding, I wore my best dress, the same one I had worn to Daniel's graduation. I smiled for photos and stayed out of the way. I helped clean up after the reception, folded chairs, picked up napkins from the ground. No one asked me to, but it felt natural. After they married, the distance grew wider. Daniel's life became full. Mine stayed simple. I watched their success from afar: new jobs, promotions, vacations. I liked their photos on social media, left heart emojis, never asked why I was not invited. As I aged, my body slowed down, but my mind stayed sharp. I managed my home, paid my bills, tended my garden. I didn't need help. I needed respect. Then one afternoon, the phone rang. Daniel's voice sounded different, serious, prepared. He talked about finances, about practicality, about how I couldn't live alone forever. He spoke as if he were making a business decision. Sophia joined the call. She talked about safety, facilities, and plans. They had already decided. They told me they were moving me into assisted living. I remember holding the phone and feeling very still, as if my body understood before my heart did. They didn't ask me what I wanted. They told me what was best. I agreed quietly, not because I believed them, but because I was tired of fighting battles no one else could see. That night, I sat alone at my table and realized something painful. I had raised my son to succeed, but I had forgotten to teach him how to honor where he came from. And in that moment, I understood my silence had shaped him just as much as my sacrifices had. The weeks after that phone call moved strangely. Time did not rush forward the way it used to. It stretched slowly, like a long afternoon that refuses to end. I began sorting my life into boxes, not just my belongings, my memories. Each drawer I opened felt like opening a small chapter of my past. Old receipts and birthday cards, handwritten notes from school teachers thanking me for raising a good boy. I read every word carefully, not to punish myself, but to remember who I had been. I packed slowly. There was no hurry. No one was waiting for me on the other side. Some days I stopped in the middle of packing and sat on the floor holding an object in my hands for far too long. A broken watch, a chipped coffee mug, a scarf Daniel had given me when he was in high school. I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. When did love start feeling like obligation? Neighbors came by when they heard I was leaving. They hugged me tightly. Some cried more than I did. Mrs. Ramirez from next door brought food. She didn't ask questions. She understood the language of quiet suffering. Daniel and Sophia arrived one morning in a polished black SUV. They moved efficiently, purposefully. Daniel carried boxes. Sophia checked her phone and gave directions. I watched them dismantle my home, not angrily, not bitterly, just silently. Daniel asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine. I had said those words my whole life. They came easily. The drive to the assisted living facility was long. The road stretched endlessly. Fields passed by like thoughts I didn't finish. I didn't talk much. There was nothing left to explain. The facility was clean, organized, safe, and completely unfamiliar. My room was small, neutral colors, a single window. Daniel placed my suitcase near the bed. Sophia pointed out the schedule on the wall. They hugged me quickly, and then they left. When the door closed behind them, the sound echoed louder than I expected. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. I didn't cry. Crying requires energy. Instead, I opened my old leather journal, the one I had kept hidden in a drawer for years. I began to write, not poetry, not anger, truth. I wrote about motherhood as it truly is, not the kind shown in greeting cards, but the quiet, exhausting, invisible kind. I wrote about staying up all night with a sick child and going to work the next morning anyway, about smiling when you were tired, about giving without counting. Days turned into weeks. Writing became my routine, my anchor. In the mornings, I wrote near the window. In the afternoons, I walked slowly through the halls. I met others like me, people with stories no one asked about. We nodded at each other. We didn't need to explain. One afternoon, a young staff member noticed my journal. She asked what I was writing. Memories, I said. She smiled gently and said, "You should share them someday." I nodded, but inside something shifted. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't writing for my son. I was writing for myself. I wrote about love that demands silence, about respect that arrives too late, about how mothers disappear into their children without realizing it. The pages filled quickly. Each word felt like a breath I had been holding for decades. I wasn't broken. I was finally speaking. By the time spring arrived, my notebook was almost full. I hadn't planned it that way. I never sat down and said, I will write a book. I only knew that if I didn't write, the weight inside me would crush what little breath I had left. Every morning followed the same gentle routine. I woke up early. Before the hallway lights came on, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window while the world slowly woke up. Birds didn't care about my past. The sky didn't ask who had abandoned me. That simple truth brought comfort. I wrote about everything I had never said out loud, about the fear of becoming invisible, about the guilt mothers carry even when they've done nothing wrong, about how love, when taken for granted, quietly turns into loneliness. I wrote about Daniel not as the man who hurt me, but as the child I once held in my arms, the boy who cried when he scraped his knee, the teenager who pretended not to need me, but still checked if I was watching. I did not write to shame him. I wrote to understand myself. Other residents noticed my routine. Some asked what I was always writing. One woman said she wished she had written her story before it was too late. That sentence stayed with me. When my journal finally ended, I sat quietly for a long time, staring at the last page. I felt lighter, not healed, but honest. A staff member helped me find a small local publisher in Austin. I mailed the pages without expectations. Weeks passed. Then one afternoon, the phone rang. A woman's voice trembled as she spoke. She told me my words felt like her own life written on paper. She said the story mattered. They published it quietly. No big marketing, no drama. But stories like mine don't need shouting. They travel through hearts. Slowly, people began talking about it. Mothers, grandmothers, women who had been silent too long. One excerpt spread online, then another. The book reached my son before it reached the world. He called me late at night. His voice was broken. He said he hadn't realized how much he had taken, how little he had given back. He apologized, truly apologized. I listened quietly. Then I said something that surprised even me. I forgive you, but forgiveness does not mean returning to who I was. There was silence on the line, and for the first time, I knew my voice had weight. Daniel visited weeks later. He looked smaller somehow, less certain. He brought flowers. He asked questions instead of giving answers. We talked like two adults, not like a mother begging for love, but like a woman who knew her worth. When he left, I did not feel empty. I felt complete. That night, I opened a new notebook, not to relive pain, but to record peace after everything had been said, after apologies were offered and accepted. Life did something unexpected. It became quiet again. But this time, the silence felt different. It did not press down on my chest. It did not feel heavy or lonely. It felt earned. My days settled into a gentle rhythm, not exciting, not dramatic, just honest. I woke up with the sun most mornings, the same way I had when Daniel was a child. Only now, there was no rush. I made my tea slowly. I sat by the window and watched the world move without me needing to chase it. There is a strange freedom in realizing you no longer need to prove your value to anyone. The nurses greeted me by name. Other residents stopped by to talk. We shared stories the way people do when there's nothing left to impress. One woman told me she wished she had loved herself sooner. Another said she spent her whole life waiting for thank you. I listened because listening has always been my strength. Sometimes Daniel called, sometimes he visited, but now the balance had changed. He listened more than he spoke. He asked before deciding. He no longer tried to manage my life, and I no longer tried to manage his guilt. We met each other where we were, not where we used to be. One afternoon, my grandchild visited again. They climbed onto my lap and played with my hands, tracing the lines on my skin. They asked what the lines meant. I told them they were maps, paths of a life well lived. They smiled as if that made perfect sense. I thought about how many years I had spent believing my purpose was to give, to sacrifice, to disappear quietly into the background. No one ever told me that survival itself was an achievement, that choosing dignity over approval was courage, that silence, when chosen, not forced, can be powerful. I began writing again, not for the world this time, just for me. I wrote about small joys, warm sunlight, shared laughter, peaceful endings. I stopped measuring my worth by how needed I was. Instead, I measured it by how whole I felt. If you are listening to my story right now, if you are a mother, a grandmother, or someone who gave everything and was left wondering if it mattered, let me say this clearly. You were never invisible. You were never weak. You were simply quiet in a world that mistakes noise for value. And one day when you choose yourself, even gently, everything changes. This is not a story about revenge. It is not a story about punishment. It is a story about awakening, about a woman who stayed silent for decades and finally learned that her voice mattered most to herself. This is how my story rests, not loud, not broken, whole. As the years continued to pass, I noticed something gentle happening inside me. I was no longer waiting, not for phone calls, not for the apologies, not for the approval. Waiting takes energy. And I had spent enough of my life doing that. My days were simple now, but full in a quiet way. I learned the names of the birds that landed near my window. I learned which afternoons brought the best sunlight. I learned how to enjoy my own company without feeling lonely. That is a lesson that takes decades to understand. Sometimes new residents arrived at the center. They looked lost. confused, carrying the same fear I once carried. I would sit beside them and listen, not to fix their pain, just to let it exist. Many of them shared similar stories: children who were busy, families that drifted, love that slowly turned into distance. I never judged because I knew how easy it was to love too much. Daniel continued to change, not overnight, but steadily. He called me before making decisions. He asked about my thoughts. Sometimes he even asked for advice. And for the first time in my life, I answered honestly, not as a mother afraid of being abandoned, but as a woman who trusted her own wisdom. One evening, he asked me if I ever regretted giving up so much for him. I thought about it for a long moment. Then I said, no, I regret forgetting myself for so long. He didn't speak after that. Some truths need silence to settle. I began to notice something else too. Other women started recognizing themselves in me. They told me my story gave them courage, not courage to fight, but courage to stop shrinking. That mattered more than any apology. Now, when I look back on my life, I see it clearly, not as a series of sacrifices, but as a journey of growth. I was a daughter, a wife, a mother, and finally, my own person. If you are listening to me right now and you feel tired in your heart, let me leave you with this. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to choose by peace. You are allowed to stop explaining your worth. Love does not disappear when you stop giving endlessly. Real love adjusts. And if it doesn't, that tells you everything you need to know. I am no longer silent because I am afraid. I am quiet because I am content. And that is the greatest strength I have ever known.